You're listening to Bangor's positive, encouraging K-Love. 101.7 WKVV, Searsport, and 102.1 WKVZ, Dexter.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
The following program is a K-Love Public Affairs presentation. Views and opinions expressed on this program aren't necessarily that of the host, staff, or management. Content may not be suitable for young children. K-Love is committed to community. Closer Look continues with a look at local agencies, events, and issues. Here's Peter Kay.
I'm joined this evening by Kevin Johnson, photo archivist at Penobscot Marine Museum. First of all, Kevin, good evening. Welcome to Closer Look.
Hi, Peter. How are you?
Doing great. Really excited to be here tonight and to find out not only more about the museum, but so much of the history of the area, of Searsport, of Dexter, of Belfast, and I'm really a little bit jealous of your job being in the archivist section of the museum. How did you get into this line of work?
It's a long, twisted tale, Peter, but the short version is I went to photo school in Rockport. While I was there, I had a chance to work with a historic collection of glass plate negatives that they owned. Due to a course of events, a flood occurred in that building where the negatives were stored, and I helped to rescue those negatives, which caused them to be donated to the Penobscot Marine Museum, and the only catch with the donation was they had to take me with the collection.
Well thought out. You're a good negotiator. For someone who hasn't been to the Penobscot Marine Museum, give me a quick virtual tour.
The Penobscot Marine Museum is the oldest maritime museum in the state. It was founded by the families of Searsport sea captains 76 years ago. And at that point, it was just one building, and we have grown to 12 buildings now, including this modern library that we're sitting in. The museum is made up of sea captains' houses, old store buildings, the former town hall, and now this modern library.
How large is the museum as a whole? You said 12 buildings.
12 buildings, and it's approximately 10 to 12 acres, I believe.
How important is the photography archives to the Marine Museum?
It's become a big part of it. Actually, when I came to the museum with this collection of 35,000 glass negatives, it was on the heels of another large collection of almost that same size that had arrived at the museum 2 years before. So instantly, we went to being one of the largest photography archives in the state, if not the largest.
What are some of the older formats? You mentioned the glass negatives. What are some of the other older formats that you have images on that are no longer in use today?
Well, we have daguerreotypes and we have tintypes. We also have old albumen prints and cabinet cards, pretty much the whole gamut of photographic mediums.
Now, before we went on the air, you showed me one of the glass plate negatives, but explain what that is.
Glass plate negatives were the film of before there was plastic. Glass was the medium that the silver nitrate was coated on. The silver nitrate is light sensitive and can capture an image, and then it's preserved on there. So a glass plate negative, they vary in size depending on the size of the camera. They're typically large format, meaning much bigger than what we think of in 35 millimeter terms. The majority of the ones that we have are 5 inches by 7 inches, but they can be 8 by 10, 11 by 14, or 4 by 5 typically.
Contrast one of the glass plate negatives to back in the day when you and I were growing up and you had your 35 millimeter and you took pictures and you sent it out to get developed. Contrast the two and the quality of the two compared to what we have now on our iPhone or what have you.
Glass plate negatives are typically large format, so they are large negatives. And if you're comparing that to 35 millimeter, a 35 millimeter negative is about the size of a postage stamp. And a 5 by 7 inch glass plate negative could fit 30 or 40 postage stamps on it. And that relates to the resolution. A large format negative has exceptional clarity when it's enlarged. Compared to blowing up a 35 millimeter slide or negative, you'll notice that it gets grainy the bigger that you enlarge it. Today with digital cameras, like your phone that you mentioned, they would have typically low resolution, though they are high resolution digital cameras now that can capture something that is comparable to large format film negatives.
Take me through the process of converting some of the older formats into digital, like some of the photos that we see on your website at penobscotmuseum.org. And then we want to get into the different categories and find out more about the history of the area.
Well, one of the goals here, or at least our biggest goal, is to digitize our collections and make them available to the public. I mean, what good would they be if they're just stored away where no one gets to see them? So we've been making our efforts to scan all of our holdings, and our holdings right now are over 140,000 photographic images. We have about 60,000 of them scanned and online now. So the typical process is we scan them with fairly high-end scanners, or in some cases we photograph them using a high-end digital SLR camera.
You're listening to Closer Look on Maine's positive, encouraging K-Love, 101.7 Searsport and 102.1 Dexter. I'm Peter Kay. He's Kevin Johnson, photo archivist at Penobscot Marine Museum. Kevin, if you would give out the various ways in which we can contact the museum.
Our website is a great place to explore what we have and what we offer, and that's penobscotmarinemuseum.org. Call us at 548-2529, and you can find us on Route 1 in Searsport.
And what are the museum's typical days and hours of operation?
Well, the museum exhibit buildings are open from Memorial Day weekend until the weekend after Columbus Day in October. The core staff, including myself, are here all year round. Anyone that wishes to visit the photo archives, for example, can always get in touch with me and make arrangements to come visit it personally, and I always enjoy showing people what I do and what we have.
Now, you had mentioned you have over 140,000 negatives, prints, slides, you name it, in the archives. Break them down into what categories that you cover.
As we mentioned, glass plate negatives, and that is probably our biggest holding because one of our collections has more than 50,000 of them. But we also have our second biggest collection are primarily 4x5 inch film negatives, and that is nearly 30,000 negatives. The rest of our collections are made up of a hodgepodge of prints, slides. We're starting to see the first wave of 35 millimeter images come in, and many people might think that 35 millimeter might be too modern for museums, but really it isn't. They started coming out in the 40s and the 50s, and really anything that's older than 10 or 20 years is, I think, museum worthy.
Focus for a little bit on the Searsport Sea Captains collection that you were showing me earlier.
So the Searsport Sea Captains, that is one of our collections, and that was put together by a volunteer that used to work at the museum, and he collected cabinet cards of all the area sea captains and used that collection to actually do a book on Searsport Sea Captains. There's a couple hundred of them, and they are available to see on our website, and we have a display dedicated to them in one of our exhibit buildings.
You had mentioned that one of the collections was unique because a woman, or I believe a young girl, had taken some of the pictures. Talk about that for a bit.
Yes, we actually have two collections that were made by young women, typically between the age of, we think, 13 and 15. One of those is Joanna Colcord, and her father was Lincoln Colcord, who was an iconic figure in Searsport. He captained the ship, the State of Maine. And Joanna was born at sea and went on many excursions with her father to the Far East and South America and made photographs on glass plates. And it was unusual for a girl to make photographs at this time, so that makes that collection unique. The other one that's similar is Ruth Montgomery, and her father was based out of Booth Bay, and she also was born at sea and went to sea with her family and made photographs, mostly of South America in that instance.
Is there a particular photograph from either of those collections that really sticks out in your mind? And if you can paint a picture, if you will, of what that looks like.
Probably the most famous photo in our collections is a photograph of Captain Lincoln Colcord on the State of Maine rounding the Cape of Good Hope. And he's standing on the back of the ship, and you can see the high seas in the background, and his arms are crossed, and he has a big smile on his face. And so the story goes that his wife was very unhappy with that picture because he did not have his teeth in.
So I can imagine. I would assume that was one of the ones that the daughter took, and whether Dad was posing or not, we don't know.
It definitely looks like he was posing.
What's one of your favorite collections?
My favorite collection is the one that brought me to the museum, and that is the Eastern Illustrating and Publishing Company collection. Eastern Illustrating was a postcard company that was based in Belfast. They started in 1909, and made real photo postcards from 1909 all the way up into the mid-1950s. They photographed all of New England and therefore all of Maine and captured so many of the small towns and villages that were pretty much ignored by the bigger postcard companies that were out there at the time. And that is a collection that I was working on in Rockport that was involved in the flood and then came here. And I've been able to actually find negatives that had escaped from that collection. And so when I began working on it, there were 35,000 negatives, and now we're above 50,000. Part of the thrill is I don't know where the end line is. Negatives keep appearing, even a couple hundred that just arrived at the museum today.
Can you talk about some of the photography that you have that's specific to the Dexter area?
Sure. Well, Eastern Illustrating would be the collection that we would have Dexter photos of, and we do have a good number of them, and they are available on our website to see. They photographed pretty much every town and village, and typically the way it would work was, for example, the photographer would leave Belfast. There were probably 6 or 7 photographers. They would leave Belfast in the spring as soon as the roads were hard enough to drive on, and they would not come back to Belfast until the fall. So they would be living on the road, and they would drive into a town like Dexter and set up in a boarding house or a hotel, and they would spend a day or two making photographs of that town. They would usually talk to the local citizens to find out what were important local features to capture because they were typically from away. After photographing for a couple days, they would send their exposed glass plates back to Belfast where they would be processed and sample postcards made. They would make arrangements with a store in that town to sell the postcards, take an order, and then move on to the next town. And they did this for decades. And the end result is a photographic survey of New England due to their efforts.
I'm Peter Kay. He's Kevin Johnson, photo archivist at Penobscot Marine Museum. You're listening to Closer Look on Maine's positive, encouraging K-Love, 101.7 Searsport and 102.1 in Dexter. Kevin, what is one of the oddest collections that you have here at the museum?
One collection that I would say is unique and has some odd elements to it is from a local photographer from Belfast. His name was Charles Coombs. Mr. Coombs was Belfast's undertaker, and he was also a furniture maker and a taxidermist, and you can see how those 3 jobs kind of all go together. But he was also a very good amateur photographer, and he documented the small town life of Belfast. I'm sure it didn't feel that small to him, but his collection has a unique feel to it. He photographed he and his friends hunting and fishing. He photographed animals that he stuffed, events that were happening in town, and he photographed his children. And it really gives a neat snapshot of a town at a certain point in time.
Earlier, you talked about the differences between various collections that the museum has as that particular person's take or angle on life at that time, whether it was in Searsport and Dexter in Belfast. But talk a little bit about that, how one person's maybe personality comes out in these collections.
Well, each of our collections has a point of view, the photographer's point of view. And when you look at a collection like Eastern Illustrating, they were making postcards, so their pictures were postcard kind of shots, not typically what we think of today of pretty pictures, but they were actually, photos of the store, photos of Main Street, government buildings. Our second biggest collection is of Red Boudelier, and he was a photojournalist, more contemporary, and he would photograph mostly the boat yards in the mid-coast, and he would photograph the boat builders, the launching of the boat, and then when he didn't have specific boat work to photograph, he would photograph things like the local quilt making club or ice making or a man who made hobby horses. So you have that perspective. And he was shooting for magazines, so that was a unique point of view. I mentioned Mr. Coombs, and that was like a local town point of view. And we have sea captains' daughters who are seeing this world that so many of their peers never got to see, and it must have been amazing. And their photographs reflect these different places and how different they were from where they were from.
So they were the National Geographics of the time.
In some cases, yes.
Behind you, you have various charts and maps, and I know that this isn't the part of the museum that you focus on, but I'd be remiss not to mention those. Tell me about those, if you would.
We're in the library building, and the library is the only modern building on our campus, and it holds many of our archives. I'm in charge of the photography aspect of it, but Sipperly Good, our records curator, is in charge of some of the other objects, which include our chart room, which we're sitting in, and that includes more than 4,000 charts of the world, local and far away, many of which are annotated by the sea captains that use them.
So these are actual charts that a sea captain would have had on the ship while trying to make his way to wherever.
Exactly.
How old do you think the oldest one is, just off the top of your head?
Well, they definitely go back into the early 1800s. And Searsport was a town of sea captains back in the day, and many of the treasures that the museum has, including these charts, were ones that were captured by the sea captains themselves.
Now, you'd mentioned earlier, again, over 140,000, I imagine, and still counting as far as images. How do you decide, how does the museum decide what ones are on display, and how do you rotate those? Is that a seasonal thing? How does that work?
First of all, all of our collections end up here, and they need to have a tie to Penobscot Bay. And that's how we justify having them as opposed to recommending that they go somewhere else. And that tie can be a little loose. For example, the Eastern Illustrating Company photographed all of New England. So we have photographs of the Adirondacks and inland Maine and Massachusetts and Rhode Island. But they were all processed and printed in Belfast. So that's the tie back to Penobscot Bay. We have photos of Hong Kong and South America from these sea captains' daughters, but they were from Searsport. That's how our collections end up as part of our archive. In terms of how we display them, each year the museum has a different exhibit. So if you can visit the museum season after season and you're not going to see the same exhibit. So we'll have a theme and we'll draw from our collections to round out whatever exhibit we're showing. Additionally, we also create exhibits that often tour. And I've made 4 county exhibits now where I've used primarily the Eastern Illustrating collection to work with local historians and find out the backstories of these photographs and then make a traveling exhibit that can then travel from town to town. My goal in that regard is to have every county captured and maybe make a book out of it down the road someday.
So as opposed to you being here in the library building each day scanning photos and doing those kinds of things, you're out and about in the community as well.
Very much so, and that's a big part of it. Most of our efforts in the photo archives are the digitization of the photos and getting them online. Less effort has been put into researching the individual images. So by connecting with these communities and showing them the images that we have in our collections that relate directly to them, it's our way of getting them to get involved and share their knowledge about these photos that we can then add to our ever-growing database.
Where are the photos coming from?
The photos come from all over, and the more effort that we have made to make them available online and make these exhibits, it seems the more collections that end up coming our way, because I think people really value their personal photo collections. I mean, they may have been taken by their grandfather or an uncle or something that they inherited, and they want them not just to be preserved, they want them to be seen and showcased and made a big deal out of, and that's what we try to do.
So if I'm going through my attic or my basement and I realize, wow, I've got an old photo album that was taken here in Maine, can I come into the museum and have you tell me about them? Can I donate them? How does that work?
People do that all the time, and if we don't think it's something that belongs here, we often can advise you a good place that it should go. But if we do think that it fits into our archives, we gladly accept donations, and it's definitely probably the biggest way that we're growing our archive.
And there's also a way for me to get them framed, correct?
There is. We have a museum framer on our campus, and she frames anything for anyone, but also does all our in-house framing. We do make beautiful prints from all of our images that we offer for sale, and it's one of the ways that we fund our operation here. And so you can order a print, and you can also have it matted and framed by Lynn, our framer.
I'm K-Love's Peter Kay. He's Kevin Johnson, photo archivist at the Penobscot Marine Museum. You're listening to Closer Look on 101.7 Positive Encouraging K-Love for Searsport and 102.1 for Dexter. Kevin, again, if you would, give out the various ways in which we can get a hold of the museum.
I definitely encourage you to visit our website at www.penobscotmarinemuseum.org. Call us at 548-2529, and you can always come visit us on Route 1 in Searsport.
Now, one of the things that you just mentioned when we were talking about framing pictures was different ways in which the museum is funded. You have an event every other summer that we're going to be doing this summer. Talk about that.
Our biggest fundraiser is our gala auction, which takes place every other year. And we have amazing items that get donated to us, and then we have an auction which usually takes place at Point Lookout in Lincolnville. And this auction is something that one can attend and bid on items in person, though we also offer an online version of that auction so you can bid from wherever you are. And that is our biggest fundraiser. But we also encourage people to join the museum and become members, and that has its own perks and benefits. And we have an annual appeal every year, which we ask people just to help us keep doing what we're doing.
Talk a little bit on the membership side of things. What are some of those perks, some of those benefits, as opposed to me coming in and checking out the museum, every once in a while?
When you're a member, you can always come to the museum for free and don't have to pay an admission. You also get a discount on all the items in our store, and you also get a discount on any prints that you might wish to order. We put out a quarterly publication called the Bay Chronicle, which has usually in-depth stories about different objects or photos in our collections. And depending on what level membership you join, there are additional perks as you go up.
Is there a particular misconception that you feel that people may have about the museum?
I think there are a few. I think when people drive by us on Route 1, they look and they see the one building and assume that's what the museum is and don't realize that we are a full campus. I think some people also think that we're just about boats, and we definitely have quite a bit about boats, but by no means are we limited to boats. We are definitely a regional history museum, and we offer educational programs and many other activities that I think have a really broad reach.
What's the most gratifying part of what you do as a photo archivist?
It's connecting with local people and showing them photos of their town or their family that elicit often fond memories and stories that we can add to our database, and they become very proud that they've been able to share some history with us that will be preserved.
Kevin, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you tonight, getting a bit of a tour of the Penobscot Marine Museum. Final thoughts before we have to run.
Well, thank you for having me, Peter. I do appreciate the exposure, and I just encourage people to check us out online first and then make an appointment and come see me and share your stories and give us your feedback and look at our photos.
Again, Kevin, absolute pleasure, and I like the pun of giving you exposure for a photo archivist. Not bad.
Thank you.
For more information on the Penobscot Marine Museum, email us at closerlook@klove.com. That's closerlook@klove.com. For Closer Look, I'm Peter Kay. Thanks for listening.
This has been K-Love Closer Look. Find us online at klove.com.